My life was built on a lie. For 9 years, I poured my soul into caring for my wife, paralyzed after a tragic accident. I sacrificed everything. Then a routine checkup, a new doctor, and a few quiet words shattered my world. He saw something I didn't. Something hidden in plain sight. His advice was chilling, unthinkable. "Mr. Carter," he said, his eyes locked on mine, "you need to call the police." The truth about my wife, my family, was a nightmare I never knew I was living. Before I tell you how my world imploded, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. And hit like and subscribe if you believe in uncovering the truth, no matter how painful. The sheets felt rough beneath my worn hands, another morning wrestling, with fitted corners that never seemed to cooperate. It was the same routine day in, day out, for 9 solid years. The clink of the metal bed rail lowering echoed slightly in the too quiet living room. Our living room now dominated by the hospital bed where my Evelyn lay. Her eyes were closed, her face peaceful in a way that twisted my gut. It wasn't real peace. I knew that now, or at least a terrible suspicion had begun to fester. I'm Benjamin Carter, 73 years old. Most folks used to call me Ben. Not many call me anything these days. My hands trembled as I prepped the feeding tube. A slight tremor that wasn't just age. It was exhaustion, bone deep and relentless, settled into me like damp cold. 9 years. 9 years since that patch of black ice on I-84 sent a semi-truck jackknifing into our lives. Evelyn, my vibrant Evelyn, who loved hiking the Boise foothills and could talk the ears off, a statue, went silent that day. Spinal cord injury, the doctors said. Severe. Complete paralysis. No speech. Nothing left but the shallow rise and fall of her chest, a life sustained by machines and my unwavering care. I gave it all up. My small woodworking shop out back, where the scent of sawdust used to be my favorite perfume, now sits gathering dust. My tools lie untouched. My fishing buddies Dave and Mike, they still called for a while, but eventually the calls dwindled. They had their own lives, grandkids, retirement trips. I had Evelyn. My world shrunk to these 4 walls, dictated by the relentless rhythm of caregiving. 6 a.m. wake-up, bed bath, changing her position, feeding through the tube. Gentle range of motion exercises, the same ones the home nurse showed me years ago, feeling more futile with each passing day. Medications administered with meticulous precision. More turning, more cleaning. Reading aloud from old novels she used to love, my voice droning in the silence, wondering if any of it registered. Then waiting. Just waiting for the hours to pass, for the next task on the endless list. The pile of bills on the desk by the window grew taller each month. My retirement savings, painstakingly built over 40 years of teaching history, were bleeding dry. The medical co-pays, the specialized equipment rentals, the nutritional supplements. It all added up. My old Ford F-150, my trusty companion on countless fishing trips, gone last year. Dad's stamp collection sold the year before that. My own meals are usually toast and canned soup now. This faded flannel shirt probably seen its 4th winter. But it didn't matter. As long as Evelyn was here, as long as I could manage, that was all that counted. I repeated it like a mantra, a fragile shield against the encroaching despair. The doorbell chimed around 2 on Saturday afternoon, a jarring sound in the usual quiet. Daniel and Chloe. Their weekly pilgrimage. Daniel, my only son, 40 now, some kind of mid-level manager at a software company downtown. And Chloe, his wife, a real estate agent, always impeccably dressed, radiating an ambition that felt sharp around the edges. "Hey Dad, how's it going?" Daniel asked, his voice lacking energy, eyes scanning the room before settling somewhere over my shoulder. He placed a small plastic grocery bag on the kitchen counter. A couple of yogurt cups, maybe a banana, the cheapest offerings from the express lane. Chloe glided over to Evelyn's bedside, leaned down and murmured something close to her ear. I never caught those words. Empty platitudes, maybe. Or something else entirely. They took their usual spots on the sofa opposite the bed, maintaining a careful distance. The conversation followed its predictable script. Polite inquiries about Evelyn's condition, the unchanging condition. Then quickly, the shift to their world. Daniel's complaints about unrealistic sales targets, Chloe's boast about closing a deal on a pricey condo, their upcoming ski trip to Sun Valley. I listened, nodding, trying to muster the appropriate responses, but felt adrift, an observer of lives that no longer intersected with mine in any meaningful way. And then the inevitable segue. So, Dad. Daniel started shifting uncomfortably, running a hand through his thinning hair, that practiced look of reluctance settling on his face. Things are a little tight this month. Young Emily's orthodontist bill came in higher than expected. Chloe would seamlessly pick up the thread, her voice smooth as silk. And my car needed new tires, wouldn't you know it, right before the holidays. Just terrible timing. Always something. Always an unforeseen expense, a temporary setback. I looked at my son. He used to be such a sensitive boy, quick to tears, quick to hug. Had life, or perhaps Chloe, hardened him? Chloe, on the other hand, was a natural. She could spin a tale of woe with the effortless grace of an actress. I sighed inwardly, reaching for my wallet. The worn leather felt thin in my hands. How much do you need? I pulled out the last $300 I had in cash from my monthly pension check. Here. But Daniel, you two really need to start budgeting better. Oh, thanks, Dad. You're a lifesaver, Daniel said, the relief immediate and palpable as he pocketed the money. We'll pay you back first thing next month, promise. It was the same promise I'd heard countless times over 9 years, a promise as empty as the space Evelyn used to fill beside me. Chloe beamed, her smile bright and triumphant. You're the best father-in-law. Just then I saw it again. A flicker. Evelyn's brow furrowed for a split second. A tiny, almost imperceptible tightening around her closed eyes. Was she reacting to the conversation, to the exchange of money, or was it just an involuntary muscle twitch? My mind raced. I remembered other times Chloe insisting on preparing Evelyn's evening medication herself. You look exhausted, Ben, let me handle it. She'd say, her efficiency almost too perfect. I know these dosages by heart. I'd been grateful then, seeing it as kindness. But now, and Evelyn's eyes. Sometimes when Daniel took the money, her gaze would follow him as he walked away, a look I couldn't quite decipher. Pleading, warning, no, impossible. I was tired, stressed. My mind was playing tricks. Get a grip, Ben. You're imagining things. They stayed another 15 minutes, filling the silence with small talk about the weather and neighborhood gossip, their restlessness growing evident. Well, we should probably get going, Daniel finally announced, glancing at his watch. Big presentation Monday morning. Chloe leaned over Evelyn again, a quick peck on the forehead. Rest well, Evelyn. We'll see you next week. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving silence and the faint scent of Chloe's expensive perfume. The small bag of groceries sat on the counter, a pathetic token left behind, after extracting a sum many times its worth. I looked towards Evelyn's bed, a heavy, unsettling feeling coiling in my stomach, a vague unease I tried desperately to push away. Left alone again, the silence of the house pressed in on me. I pulled my worn armchair closer to Evelyn's bed, picked up the collection of Robert Frost poems she loved. My voice felt rusty as I read aloud about snowy woods and paths not taken. Sometimes I'd pause, searching her still face for any sign, any flicker of recognition, behind the closed lids. Was she in there? Did she hear my voice, feel the loneliness that wrapped around me like a shroud? My old friends drifted away, not out of malice, just the natural course of lives diverging. Dave, my fishing partner for 2 decades, moved to Florida to be near his daughter. Mike, who worked alongside me in the shop, called less and less. His wife's illness took up all his energy. My world had shrunk. Who wants to spend their golden years listening to an old man's repetitive tales of medication schedules and bed sores? My life offered no new stories, only the monotonous loop of caregiving. I looked at Evelyn, and the memories flooded back sharp and painful. Evelyn before the accident, always busy humming as she gardened, organizing neighborhood potlucks, dragging me onto the dance floor at weddings, even though I have 2 left feet. She was the anchor, the vibrant center of our family. Seeing her now, a fragile vessel kept breathing by tubes and wires, felt like a constant dull ache in my chest. If only I hadn't taken that shortcut. If only the roads hadn't been icy. If only... The guilt was a shadow I couldn't shake. I hadn't kept her safe. This constant care, this vigil, it was taking its toll. My back screamed in protest every time I had to lift or turn her. Sleep offered little respite, fragmented by worry, by Evelyn's occasional coughs, by the beeping monitors. I'd lost weight, my hair had gone completely white, and the face staring back from the bathroom mirror looked hollowed out, older than my 73 years. Trips outside were rare, strictly functional. Groceries, pharmacy runs, doctor's appointments. The world beyond my front door felt distant, unreal. Some nights when the house was utterly still save for the rhythmic sigh of Evelyn's ventilator, I'd sit alone in the dim kitchen light, nursing a cold cup of tea. The loneliness was a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. I missed talking to Evelyn, laughing with her, even arguing with her. Now only silence answered back. Daniel and Chloe were absorbed in their own orbits, fueled by ambition and social climbing. They saw my devotion to their mother as expected my duty. They didn't see or chose not to see the man disappearing behind the caregiver role. They didn't see that I too needed connection, conversation, a simple acknowledgement that I still existed beyond this room. But maybe I'd enabled this. Maybe I'd spoiled Daniel too much after his mother's accident, shielding him from the harsh realities. Maybe I'd accepted the role of the silent martyr too readily. I never drew lines, never demanded help or respect. I just gave quietly, endlessly, hoping my sacrifice would be recognized, my love returned. But 9 years on, I was still just Ben Carter, the lonely old man caring for his silent wife, the convenient bank for his increasingly distant children. Life felt like a long, slow fade into gray. Until that day at the hospital when a few unexpected words from a stranger cracked the facade wide open. It started subtly, a slight rasp in Evelyn's breathing that Tuesday morning. I chalked it up to the dry autumn air, maybe a bit of congestion. But by afternoon, the rasp had deepened into a worrying wheeze. Her forehead felt clammy, unnaturally warm beneath my palm. A fever. Low grade at first, but climbing steadily. Panic began to prickle at the edges of my carefully maintained composure. 9 years we'd managed everything at home, avoiding hospitals except for scheduled check-ins. But this felt different. This felt urgent. Her breathing grew shallower, each inhale a visible effort. The pulse oximeter I clipped to her finger showed her oxygen levels dipping below 90. Alarm bells screamed in my head. This wasn't something I could handle alone with her usual nebulizer treatments. My hands shook as I reached for the phone, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Calling 911 felt like admitting defeat, like I'd failed her somehow. But her labored breaths left me no choice. Waiting for the paramedics felt like an eternity, my gaze fixed on Evelyn's still face, praying silently. St. Luke's downtown felt colder, brighter, more impersonal than I remembered. The emergency room buzzed with a controlled chaos. Beeping machines, hurried footsteps on linoleum floors, hushed conversations, laced with medical jargon. The sharp scent of antiseptic burned my nostrils. They whisked Evelyn away almost immediately, leaving me adrift in a sea of plastic chairs and anxious faces in the waiting area. I sat there clutching a crumpled tissue, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. Pneumonia. A lung infection. Something worse. Hours crawled by. I tried reading a tattered magazine, but the words blurred. Every time a nurse walked by, my head snapped up, hope and dread warring within me. Daniel and Chloe arrived nearly 2 hours after I called them. Daniel gave me a quick, awkward hug. "How is she, Dad?" he asked, his eyes already drifting towards the glowing screen of his phone. Chloe offered a tight smile. Poor Evelyn. This must be so stressful for you, Ben. Her sympathy felt thin, brittle. They sat down, but their presence offered little comfort. Daniel was soon engrossed in emails, his brow furrowed in concentration. Chloe scrolled through her social media feed, occasionally sighing dramatically about a missed showing or a difficult client. They asked the nurse for updates once, maybe twice, but their concern seemed performative, overshadowed by the constant pull of their own busy lives. Watching them, a familiar weariness washed over me, heavier than the fear for Evelyn. Late that evening, a doctor I hadn't met before approached me as I sat slumped in the waiting room chair. He looked younger than the attending physician, maybe early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an air of quiet intensity. "Mr. Carter," he asked softly. I nodded, bracing myself for bad news. "I'm Dr. Ramirez, one of the physicians reviewing your wife's case. Good news first, the antibiotics seem to be working, Mrs. Carter's pneumonia is responding well, and her vitals are stable." Relief washed over me, so potent it almost brought tears. "Thank God," I whispered. Dr. Ramirez hesitated for a moment. "There are a few other things, though, observations from her recent tests and a review of her long-term records. Would you mind stepping into my office for a moment? It might be easier to discuss privately." A knot tightened in my stomach. Privately. Why, Daniel and Chloe had left an hour ago, citing early meetings. It was just me. His office was small, functional, dominated by a large desk, covered in files and medical journals. He gestured for me to sit. "Mr. Carter," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I understand your wife suffered a severe spinal cord injury 9 years ago, resulting in paralysis." I nodded numbly. "Yes, complete paralysis. She hasn't moved or spoken since." Dr. Ramirez looked down at a chart, then back at me. "That's what the initial diagnosis indicated. However, during the neurological exam today, we noted some inconsistencies. Certain deep tendon reflexes, particularly in her lower limbs, showed a faint response. It's subtle, easily missed, perhaps, in a non-hospital setting, but it's not entirely typical for the level and type of injury described in her original file. It suggests some nerve pathways might still be partially intact, more than previously thought." He paused, letting that sink in. Faint response after 9 years of nothing. It didn't make sense. "But she's never moved," I stammered. "Not a twitch." "I understand," Dr. Ramirez continued patiently. "Which brings me to the second point. We ran comprehensive blood work due to the infection. Standard procedure. What struck us was the persistently high level of certain medications in her system, specifically benzodiazepines, sedatives, and powerful muscle relaxants. The levels are significantly higher than what we'd typically prescribe for managing spasticity or anxiety in a long-term paralysis patient, unless there were extreme uncontrolled spasms which don't seem to be documented in her recent history." He leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Carter, these aren't just slightly elevated levels. They're consistently high, suggesting prolonged administration at dosages that could induce significant lethargy, weakness, and suppress neurological responses in almost anyone, let alone someone with a pre-existing injury. Frankly, levels like these maintained over time could mimic or severely worsen symptoms of paralysis, making it very difficult to assess the true extent of the underlying neurological damage." My head started spinning. High levels. Chloe always handled the medications. She said the doctors prescribed them. Were the dosages wrong for 9 years? Furthermore, Dr. Ramirez pressed on, his voice, still gentle, but firm. "The pattern of muscle atrophy observed isn't entirely uniform. Yes, there's significant wasting as expected after 9 years. But some muscle groups, particularly smaller ones in the hands and feet, show slightly less atrophy than anticipated, given the diagnosis of complete spinal severance at that level. Again, it's subtle. But combined with the reflex responses and the medication levels, it raises questions." He tapped a pen on the file. It suggests the possibility, just a possibility, mind you, that there might be some residual nerve function that has been consistently suppressed, preventing any potential for even minor voluntary movement or clearer assessment. Questions. Inconsistencies. Suppressed function. The words bombarded me, chipping away at the reality I'd accepted for nearly a decade. And lastly, Mr. Carter, Dr. Ramirez said, his gaze direct and filled with a gravity that made my breath catch. During my rounds this afternoon, when your son and daughter-in-law had stepped out, I spent some time observing Mrs. Carter. When I spoke to her directly, quietly, I noticed a distinct flicker in her eyelids. Not just a random twitch, but a seemingly responsive movement when I mentioned your name. And later a slight, almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes when a loud noise occurred in the hallway. These are minuscule signs easily dismissed, but taken together with the other clinical findings. He let the sentence hang, the implication echoing in the silence. My mind flashed back. Evelyn's furrowed brow when Daniel took the money, the pleading look I thought I'd imagined, the times I felt she was more present than she appeared. Had I been dismissing real signs all along? Had I been blind? The doctor's words painted a picture so monstrous, so fundamentally wrong, that my mind recoiled. Yet the pieces, ugly and jagged, were starting to fit together in a way that terrified me. Dr. Ramirez leaned back slightly, his expression somber. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice low but clear. "When you put all these pieces together, the inconsistent reflexes, the unusually high medication levels, the uneven muscle atrophy, and those subtle signs of awareness, it paints a very concerning picture. These findings strongly suggest that Mrs. Carter's current condition might not solely be the result of the original injury. There's a distinct possibility, a troubling one, that her state has been significantly influenced, perhaps even maintained by external factors." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Specifically, the prolonged high dosage of sedative and muscle relaxant medications. It raises the question of whether her true potential for recovery, however limited it might have been, has been masked or actively suppressed over these 9 years. And the term actively suppressed hung in the air, cold and sharp. He wasn't just talking about a medical misjudgment anymore. He was implying intent. He took off his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose for a moment, before looking directly at me again. "Look, I don't want to cause you undue distress. I know you've dedicated your life to caring for your wife. But as a physician, my primary responsibility is to my patient. My conscience, my professional ethics compel me to address these discrepancies. Ignoring them would be negligent. I've seen situations, unfortunately, where caregivers, for various reasons, sometimes misguided, sometimes malicious, misuse medication to manage or control a dependent individual." He wasn't accusing me, his tone was careful, but the implication was clear. Someone might be harming Evelyn intentionally, keeping her in this state. He leaned forward again, his gaze unwavering, the kindness in his eyes now mixed with a stark urgency. "Mr. Carter," he said. The softness gone from his voice, replaced by a firm gravity that made the small office feel suddenly cold. "I cannot make a definitive diagnosis of abuse or neglect without further investigations that go beyond the scope of this hospital visit. But based on the objective medical evidence and my clinical observations," he hesitated, as if gathering the courage to say the unthinkable, "Mr. Carter, I genuinely believe you should consider involving the police. Let them conduct a professional inquiry. There is something profoundly wrong here, and I fear your wife may be in a very vulnerable, perhaps even dangerous situation." "Call the police." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. Police about my family, about Evelyn. It was insane. Impossible. My mind reeled, refusing to grasp the monstrous suggestion. The floor seemed to drop out from under me, leaving me suspended in a terrifying void of disbelief and dawning horror. I walked out of Dr. Ramirez's office like a man in a daze. His words echoed in the sterile hallway, bouncing off the polished floors, each syllable a hammer blow against the fragile walls of my reality. Call the police. It was ludicrous, preposterous, an insult. My first reaction was a surge of white-hot anger directed at the doctor. How dare he sit there in his starched white coat and cast such vile suspicion on my family, on me 9 years. 9 years I had devoted every waking moment, every ounce of my energy to Evelyn. I bathed her, fed her, turned her reed to her, loved her unconditionally. And this doctor, this stranger implies, what? That I, or worse my own son, had somehow been harming her, keeping her sick. It was unthinkable. A monstrous accusation born of cynicism or incompetence. He didn't know us. He didn't know our love, our sacrifice. He saw charts and numbers, not the soul-crushing reality of our daily lives. I found an empty chair in a deserted corner of the waiting area, away from the low murmur of the television and the shuffling feet of other worried families. I needed to think, to push back against the absurdity. Doctors make mistakes. Ramirez was probably young, overly cautious, seeing zebras where there were only horses. Those reflexes, probably just random nerve firings, meaningless twitches. The medication levels, maybe Evelyn's system processed them differently now. Maybe her previous doctors had prescribed them that way for a reason Ramirez didn't understand. Chloe handled the meds because she was younger, more organized, her hands steadier than mine. It was helpful, not sinister. Daniel and Chloe asked for money because life was hard, because raising kids and maintaining a career was expensive. They weren't villains. They were just struggling like everyone else. I clung to these explanations, repeating them in my head, trying to rebuild the dam Ramirez's words had breached. My life, my sacrifice had to mean something. It couldn't all be based on a lie. But the seed of doubt, once planted, began to sprout insidious roots. Call the police. The phrase wouldn't leave me alone. Why would a doctor risk his reputation, risk offending a grieving husband by suggesting something so drastic unless he genuinely believed it? Inconsistencies, high medication levels, suppressed function. The clinical terms swirled in my mind, refusing to be dismissed. Then unwelcome memories surfaced, fragments I'd long ignored. The time, maybe 3 years ago, when Sarah Jenkins, the kind home care nurse we'd had for a while, quit suddenly. She'd mumbled something about feeling uncomfortable about disagreements over medication schedules with Chloe. At the time, I'd sided with Chloe, assuming Sarah was just being difficult. Had Sarah seen something too? And Chloe's insistence on always being the one to give Evelyn her evening pills, shooing me away, gently saying I needed rest. Was it care or control? Evelyn's eyes. That flicker Ramirez mentioned. Had I seen it before? Yes. Brief moments easily dismissed as tricks of the light or my own fatigue-addled imagination. Moments when she seemed present. A slight tightening around her mouth when Daniel would talk loudly on his phone near her bed. A brief widening of her eyes when Chloe dropped a tray once. Had she been trying to communicate, trapped behind a wall of drugs and enforced silence? The thought was a physical pain, a sharp stab beneath my ribs. I felt torn in two, caught between the instinct to protect my son and the terrifying possibility that my wife, the woman I loved more than life itself, had been suffering a different kind of imprisonment all these years right under my nose. I decided then, sitting there under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital, that I couldn't just dismiss Dr. Ramirez's words no matter how much they horrified me. I wouldn't call the police, not yet. That felt like a betrayal too immense to contemplate based solely on suspicion. But I would watch. I would listen. Not with the eyes of an accuser, not initially anyway, but with the desperate hope of proving the doctor wrong, of finding simple explanations for the inconsistencies he'd pointed out. I needed to reassure myself that my family, my life, wasn't the monstrous lie he hinted at. Evelyn was still in the hospital, recovering from the pneumonia, giving me a different vantage point. When Daniel and Chloe came the next day, I tested the waters cautiously. You know, I began trying to sound casual. That new Dr. Ramirez, he mentioned some Unusual reflex responses Evelyn had. Said he hadn't seen that often with her type of injury. Chloe immediately waved a dismissive hand. Oh, those young doctors always looking to find something new to write a paper about. Evelyn's condition hasn't changed in 9 years, Ben. It's probably just involuntary spasms. Don't let him worry you. Daniel chimed in quickly, perhaps too quickly. Yeah, Dad. You're stressed enough as it is. Ramirez probably just doesn't have her full history. We know Mom's baseline. They seemed overly eager to shut down the conversation, changing the subject to the hospital food and how uncomfortable the visiting chairs were. There was a subtle tension in their shoulders, a forced brightness in their smiles that hadn't been there before. Later, I overheard Chloe telling Daniel quietly but firmly outside Evelyn's room. We need to talk to the attending physician, make sure Ramirez doesn't overstep. Overstep. Why would thoroughness be considered overstepping unless they had something to hide? My focus sharpened, zeroing in on the aspect Ramirez had emphasized: the medication. When Evelyn was eventually discharged back home a few days later, Chloe resumed her role as the efficient medication administrator. Okay, time for Evelyn's relaxants, she'd announce cheerfully each evening, carefully sorting pills into a weekly dispenser. I started paying closer attention. Which ones are those again, Chloe? I asked one night, pointing to the small blue pills. Oh, just the usual muscle relaxant Dr. Peterson prescribed years ago, she replied breezily, not meeting my eye. Helps keep her comfortable. The dosage hasn't changed, I pressed gently. Why would it? She snapped back, a flash of irritation crossing her face before she smoothed it over. It's what works. Don't worry about it, Ben. I've got it handled. Her defensiveness was a tiny red flag. Later that week, while Chloe was out running errands, I went to the medicine cabinet. I found the current bottles' names I vaguely recognized. Then hidden at the back, I found an older, almost empty bottle of the same blue pills prescribed years earlier. My hands trembled slightly as I compared the labels. The dosage on the old bottle was significantly lower than what was listed on the current one. Had Dr. Peterson really increased it so drastically, or had Chloe? I made a mental note of the prescribing doctor's name on the new bottle, someone I didn't recognize. Why had they changed doctors without telling me? My senses, dulled by years of routine and grief, felt newly alert. I started noticing things I hadn't before. Daniel pacing in the backyard while talking on his cell phone, his voice low and urgent, occasionally glancing back towards the house. Chloe spending long periods in their room with the door closed after our brief tense conversations about Evelyn's medication or finances emerging later, with red-rimmed eyes, but a composed facade. Once I walked into the kitchen unexpectedly and heard the tail end of a hushed, angry exchange between them. Can't keep this up forever, Chloe. What if he finds out? Daniel hissed. He won't find out if you just stick to the plan? She whispered back fiercely before they both fell silent, startled by my presence. They quickly plastered on smiles, asking if I needed anything, but the air crackled with unspoken tension. Their secretive behavior, the palpable stress radiating from them, whenever I brought up anything remotely sensitive, contrasted sharply with the image of caring, albeit busy children they projected. Driven by a growing unease, I found myself rummaging through the old filing cabinet in the spare room one afternoon, looking for Evelyn's birth certificate for some hospital paperwork. My fingers brushed against a thick manila folder labeled Accident and Insurance, 2016. I pulled it out, dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. Inside were the police reports, copies of insurance claims, hospital discharge summaries. I hadn't looked at these papers in years. The pain had been too raw. Now I forced myself to read them with fresh eyes, Dr. Ramirez's words echoing in my mind. The police report seemed straightforward enough. Icy roads, loss of control, tragic accident. But the insurance section. Evelyn had a substantial life insurance policy taken out shortly after Daniel was born, standard practice. But there was also a secondary accident-specific policy with a surprisingly large payout for permanent disability, added just 6 months before the crash. I didn't remember discussing that second policy with her. Who had initiated it and the beneficiary paperwork? Chloe's name was listed alongside mine as a secondary contact and recipient for claim information. Why I tried to recall Daniel and Chloe's reaction in the chaotic days following the accident. Had they seemed overly interested in the financial aspects, I remembered Chloe being remarkably efficient in dealing with the insurance adjusters handling mountains of paperwork while I was numb with grief. Had her efficiency masked something else, a cold dread began to seep into me. The accident itself might have been random, unavoidable, but had my son and daughter-in-law seen it not just as a tragedy, but also as an opportunity? Sarah Jenkins. The name surfaced from the fog of the past. The nurse who'd left so abruptly 3 years ago. Finding her wasn't easy. She'd moved out of state, but after a few determined calls to old nursing agencies, I tracked down a number for her in Oregon. My hand felt clammy as I dialed. What if she refused to talk? What if she thought I was crazy? Hello? Her voice was cautious. Sarah, it's Ben Carter, Evelyn Carter's husband. There was a long pause. Mr. Carter, she finally said, her tone guarded. It's been a long time. Is everything all right with Evelyn? I took a deep breath. Sarah, I need to ask you something important. About why you left. You mentioned feeling uncomfortable. Another pause, longer this time. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. I probably shouldn't. Chloe, your daughter-in-law, she made things difficult. Difficult how, Sarah? Please. It's vital I understand. I explained briefly about the new doctor's concerns, the medication levels. Sarah sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. All right, she conceded. Chloe was controlling, especially about the medication. She insisted on administering the evening doses herself, even when I was there. A few times I noticed the dosages she prepared seemed higher than what was charted, especially the sedatives. When I questioned her, she became very defensive, said she had specific instructions from a specialist I didn't know. Sarah continued. And Evelyn. Sometimes when Chloe wasn't around, I felt she was more aware. A slight squeeze of my hand, a flicker in her eyes when I talked about her garden. But whenever Chloe was present, Evelyn seemed completely non-responsive. I tried mentioning it subtly, but Chloe dismissed it as wishful thinking, even got angry once. I got a bad feeling, Mr. Carter, like something wasn't right. I couldn't prove anything, and frankly, Chloe made me feel like I was imagining things, even threatened to report me for questioning her care. So I left. I couldn't work in that environment. Her words, hesitant but clear, were a chilling confirmation. Someone else had seen it too. Sarah's confession solidified a dreadful resolve within me. Observation wasn't enough anymore. I needed proof, undeniable proof. The idea felt repugnant, a violation of the very home I cherished, but the alternative, allowing this potential horror to continue, was unbearable. How could I get proof? Sarah, perhaps sensing my desperation, had mentioned offhand during our call how some families used small cameras to monitor caregivers. It sparked an idea. Online, I found them easily. Tiny cameras disguised as everyday objects. A clock radio for the bedside table, a simple digital photo frame. It felt like a betrayal, spying in my own home. But whose betrayal was greater? Mine for seeking the truth, or theirs? If they were truly committing such an insidious act, I ordered a small motion-activated camera hidden inside a functional digital clock. Setting it up on Evelyn's bedside table, angled towards the bed, and the area where medications were usually prepared, made my stomach churn. But I had to know, for Evelyn's sake, for my own sanity. While waiting for whatever the camera might reveal, I focused on the other tangible element, money. Dr. Ramirez's suspicions, Sarah's unease, the insurance policies, they all seemed to orbit a potential financial motive. I went back to the bank this time, asking for detailed statements for the joint account, and my savings account going back the full 9 years. The manager, Mr. Henderson, looked sympathetic as the printer churned out page after page. "Quite a history here, Mr. Carter," he commented mildly. Back home, spreading the statements across the kitchen table felt like excavating a painful past. The numbers told a story I had refused to read. The small loans Daniel and Chloe had requested weren't small at all. Thousands of dollars withdrawn regularly. Large sums around the times they mentioned car troubles, medical bills for imagined ailments, or investment opportunities that never seemed to materialize. There were no deposits indicating repayment. None. Then I started cross-referencing dates. A $5,000 withdrawal just before their 10th anniversary trip to Europe. A trip they'd told me was funded by Chloe's bonus. A series of $2,000 withdrawals coinciding with the down payment on Daniel's luxury SUV, a vehicle he claimed he got through a company lease program. Credit card payments made from my account to high-end department stores charges I didn't recognize. The total was staggering, far exceeding the rough estimates I'd made. Over 9 years, it wasn't just my savings that had vanished. A significant chunk of the initial insurance payout for Evelyn's disability had been systematically siphoned off. They hadn't just been borrowing. They had been bleeding me dry funding, a lifestyle completely at odds with their constant narrative of financial struggle. The camera yielded its terrible fruit 3 days later. I plugged the small memory card into my old laptop, my hands shaking so badly I could barely guide it into the slot. The footage started innocuously. Me reading to Evelyn, the home health aide, doing her routine checks. Then evening came. Chloe entered the frame humming softly, carrying Evelyn's usual array of pill cups. She set them down, glanced towards the hallway, then quickly opened one of the bottles, the blue pills Sarah had mentioned. Instead of taking out the prescribed 2, she shook out 3, hesitated, then added a 4th, crushing them slightly with the back of a spoon, before mixing them into the applesauce she used to administer the medication. She then carefully put the bottle back, making sure it looked untouched. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. The footage continued. A few nights later, the audio picked up a hushed argument between Daniel and Chloe after I had gone to bed. Getting impatient. Daniel, 9 years, Ramirez is asking too many questions. Chloe's voice was sharp, strained. What do you want me to do? Daniel retorted, his voice muffled but audible. Increase it too much and someone will notice. Sarah almost did. We just need to keep him needing money. Keep him focused on that, not on her. Keep him needing money. Keep me focused on their fabricated crises. It wasn't just about controlling Evelyn. It was about controlling me through financial manipulation, keeping me too poor and too worried to question anything too closely. Then perhaps the most heartbreaking clip footage from an afternoon when I'd stepped out briefly to get groceries. Evelyn was alone. The camera caught it. A clear, deliberate movement of her left hand, fingers curling slightly, then uncurling. A conscious action, not a spasm. Followed by a slow, agonizingly slow turn of her head towards the window, her eyes open for a fleeting second, holding an unmistakable look of awareness, of deep, soul-crushing sadness, before fluttering shut again, as if the effort was too much or the despair too deep. There it was. Undeniable. The slight movements I'd dismissed, the medication levels, Ramirez flagged Sarah's suspicions, the financial drain, Chloe's furtive actions, Daniel's complicity, Evelyn's flicker of consciousness. It all coalesced into a single monstrous truth. My son, my own son Daniel, had conspired with his wife not just to steal from me, but to keep his own mother in a drugged, near-comatose state for 9 years. The betrayal was absolute, shattering the very foundation of my world. The laptop screen glowed in the darkened living room, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe like the ugly secrets I had unearthed. I sat at the old oak table, the surface covered not with woodworking plans or history books, but with the wreckage of my life laid bare. The small digital clock camera sat beside the laptop, its lens now feeling like an accusatory eye. Printed copies of bank statements formed damning columns of figures, each withdrawal a stab wound to my trust. The insurance policies, yellowed slightly at the edges, seemed to mock me with their cold contractual language. Beneficiaries' payouts clauses I'd never truly understood. Sarah Jenkins's tearful, hesitant statement, transcribed from our phone call, lay beside Dr. Ramirez's meticulously detailed medical report. And then there were the recordings, the audio files saved, the video clips bookmarked. Chloe's hand hovering over the pill bottle, the hushed, venomous whispers between her and Daniel Evelyn's heartbreakingly small movement. Piece by agonizing piece, I assembled the puzzle. 9 years. It wasn't just passive neglect or opportunistic greed. It was a calculated long-term strategy. The increased insurance policies secured just before the accident. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps chilling foresight. The immediate control Chloe exerted over Evelyn's medication, disguised as helpfulness. The constant escalating financial demands from both Daniel and Chloe, creating crises that kept me distracted and dependent on their supposed support, while systematically draining my resources. The dismissal of any potential signs of Evelyn's awareness. The lies about her condition, about doctors' recommendations, about finances. It was all there. A meticulous, cruel deception designed to keep Evelyn imprisoned in her own body, and me trapped in a cycle of caregiving and financial depletion, all while they lived comfortably, even luxuriously, off the proceeds of this quiet horror. The motive stared back at me from the bank statements and the insurance payout figures. Money. Control. Perhaps even a twisted resentment for the burden of care they never intended to shoulder themselves. The realization settled over me cold and heavy as a shroud. My son. My Daniel. Not just passively complicit, but an active participant, maybe even the architect alongside Chloe. He wasn't just weak. He was cruel. He had looked me in the eye week after week, accepted my hard-earned money, listened to my worries about Evelyn, all while knowing the truth, all while perpetuating the lie that was slowly destroying both his parents. The image of the sweet boy who used to hold my hand, the young man I'd been so proud of at his college graduation. That image shattered, replaced by the face of a stranger capable of unimaginable betrayal. The love I felt for him curdled into something akin to horrified revulsion. How could he? How could anyone do this to another human being, let alone their own mother? The choice lay before me, stark and terrible. Protect my son, bury this monstrous secret, and condemn Evelyn to potentially years more of this living death, becoming complicit myself through silence. Or expose the truth, unleash the legal storm, destroy what was left of my family, but potentially free Evelyn and find some semblance of justice. My mind screamed denial, pleaded for another explanation, a way out that didn't involve such utter devastation. Couldn't I just confront them, make them stop? But the recordings, their cold calculation told me confrontation would be useless. They were too deep in, too committed to the lie. They would deny, manipulate, perhaps even escalate their actions if they felt threatened. Dr. Ramirez's words echoed, "Call the police." It had seemed insane then. Now surrounded by the undeniable proof of their depravity, it felt like the only path left. My love for Evelyn, the memory of the vibrant woman she was, the burning rage at their 9 years of calculated cruelty, the simple fundamental need for truth and justice. It all converged. The instinct to protect my child warred fiercely with the duty to protect my wife. It was the most agonizing decision of my life, tearing me apart. But looking at the faint movement on the video clip, Evelyn's hand curling, her eyes briefly open, that tiny spark of life they had tried so hard to extinguish, the choice became clear. It wasn't even a choice anymore. It was an obligation. An act of love for Evelyn that demanded the ultimate sacrifice of my relationship with my son. The dam of denial finally broke, and grief mixed with a cold, hard resolve flooded through me. I reached for the phone. My hand hovered over the phone, the numbers for the Boise Police Department, seeming impossibly large on the screen. Making this call felt like crossing a Rubicon, irrevocably severing ties with my own son. But Evelyn's face, pale and still on the video clip, gave me the strength I needed. I dialed. My voice was surprisingly steady when the dispatcher answered. "I need to report a potential crime," I said, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. "Abuse of a dependent adult, possibly something worse." I explained the situation briefly, mentioning Dr. Ramirez's concerns and the evidence I had gathered. I requested to speak with a detective experienced in sensitive family matters. An hour later, a Detective Miller called me back. His voice was calm, professional, non-judgmental. He listened patiently as I stumbled through the horrific story, interjecting only with clarifying questions. "Mr. Carter," he said when I finished, "this sounds deeply disturbing. I'd like to meet with you in person as soon as possible. Can you come down to the station, bring everything you have?" And the police station felt alien, a place I'd only seen in movies. Detective Miller met me in a small private interview room. He was a man about Daniel's age, maybe a bit older, with tired eyes that suggested he'd seen too much of the darker side of life, but also a reassuringly solid presence. I laid everything out on the table between us, the folder containing Dr. Ramirez's report, Sarah Jenkins's transcribed statement, the thick stack of bank statements with highlighted withdrawals, the insurance policies, the digital clock camera, and the laptop, queued up to the crucial video and audio files. My hands trembled as I explained each piece, my voice thick with a grief that felt bottomless. Detective Miller examined everything meticulously, his expression growing grimmer with each piece of evidence. He watched the video clip of Chloe altering the medication without comment, his jaw tightening slightly. He listened intently to the audio recording of Daniel and Chloe arguing, his brow furrowed. When he saw the brief clip of Evelyn moving her hand, he paused the playback, looking at it several times before meeting my gaze. His eyes held a mixture of professional assessment and, I thought, a flicker of human empathy. "Mr. Carter," he said finally, his voice low and serious, "this is extremely compelling evidence. The medication tampering, the financial records, the medical inconsistencies, coupled with your testimony and the nurse's statement, this paints a very clear picture of long-term abuse and potential intent far beyond neglect." He leaned back, running a hand over his face. "Frankly, this is one of the more disturbing cases of elder and dependent adult abuse I've encountered. We need to proceed carefully, but we need to proceed." Detective Miller wasted no time. A quiet meeting was arranged the next morning, just the three of us, Miller, Dr. Ramirez, and myself, in a nondescript conference room at the police station. The air was thick with purpose. Miller laid out the legal requirements, while the past evidence was strong, capturing their current reaction. Their guilty knowledge in action would solidify the case, especially regarding intent. Dr. Ramirez agreed, emphasizing the need to create a situation that would force their hand without directly alerting them to the full extent of our knowledge. We needed a catalyst, a carefully constructed scenario. We decided against Dr. Ramirez making the call himself. It might raise too much suspicion, seem too official. Instead, the plan centered on me, the hopeful, perhaps slightly naive husband, relaying supposedly good news. The story would be that Dr. Ramirez, during Evelyn's hospital stay and follow-up review, had noticed continued subtle signs, perhaps a more consistent eye response, a slight reduction in muscle rigidity in one hand. Things that gave him, in his professional opinion, a glimmer of unexpected hope. He supposedly suggested to me that while a full recovery was highly unlikely, perhaps some intensive specialized therapy might yield minor improvements, maybe even regain some limited communication. Crucially, Ramirez supposedly recommended a new, highly regarded physical therapist, a specialist from outside Boise, maybe Portland, known for innovative techniques with severe neurological cases. I would tell Daniel and Chloe that I'd already reached out, and this therapist, Dr. Alistair Finch, had agreed to come for an initial in-home consultation next week. I would present it as my own decision fueled by Ramirez's cautious optimism, a desperate husband clinging to any shred of hope. I practiced the delivery in my mind, the hopeful tone, the slight tremor of excitement, masking the cold dread beneath. We needed them to believe I was acting independently, driven by love and a renewed, perhaps foolish optimism. The objective was simple yet fraught with tension: to see how they would react to the prospect of external expert eyes examining Evelyn closely outside of their controlled environment. Would the idea of potential, albeit minor, improvement and scrutiny send them into a panic? Would they try to dissuade me, perhaps citing the cost, the futility, the stress on Evelyn, or worse, would they take more drastic measures to ensure Evelyn remained silent and unresponsive before this new therapist arrived? We needed to provoke them carefully into revealing their fear, their guilt, their ongoing conspiracy. Their reaction caught on tape would be the final nail in the coffin. The surveillance net tightened significantly. Detective Miller's team, armed with the evidence I'd provided, had secured the necessary warrants with surprising speed. Wiretaps were placed on Daniel and Chloe's cell phones and our home landline. The digital clock camera in Evelyn's room remained active, its memory card swapped out daily by me under the guise of adjusting the time. An unmarked police car began occasional discreet patrols down our quiet suburban street, monitoring comings and goings. Miller assured me they would be close, ready to intervene if necessary, but the goal was to capture evidence, not to precipitate a confrontation prematurely. Waiting for the right moment to deliver my good news, waiting for them to take the bait, was excruciating. Every time the phone rang, my heart leaped. Every shared glance with Evelyn felt heavy with unspoken secrets. The house, once a sanctuary of quiet routine, now felt like a stage waiting for the final terrible act to unfold. I made the call that evening, dialing Daniel's number, my thumb hovering over the button for a second before I pressed it. I kept my voice deliberately light, injecting a note of hesitant hope I hadn't felt in years. "Daniel, son, you won't believe this. Dr. Ramirez, that new doctor at the hospital, he thinks there might be a tiny chance for some improvement with your mother." I relayed the fabricated story, the subtle reflexes, the cautious optimism, the recommendation for the specialist, Dr. Finch from Portland. "I already contacted him," I added, pushing the narrative. "He's agreed to come for an in-home assessment next Tuesday." There was a beat of silence on the other end, longer than expected. "Dad," Daniel finally said. His voice strained. "That's unexpected. Are you sure? After all this time?" "I know, son, I know," I replied, forcing enthusiasm. "But Ramirez seemed quite certain about what he saw. We have to try, don't we, for her?" Yeah, of course, Dad," he said, but the lack of genuine excitement was palpable. "Let me talk to Chloe. We'll call you back." The call back never came, but the hidden camera, my silent, unblinking witness, captured the aftermath later that night. The audio feed, monitored discreetly by Detective Miller's team, picked up their panicked conversation, bleeding through their closed bedroom door after they thought I was asleep. "Portland. Next Tuesday, are you kidding me?" Chloe's voice was a furious whisper. "This Ramirez guy is digging too deep. What if this Finch person actually finds something?" "Calm down," Daniel hissed back, though his voice trembled. "We'll handle it. We'll tell Dad it's too expensive, that it'll stress Mom out too much. We'll find a reason." "Reasons aren't enough anymore, Daniel," Chloe retorted. He sounded hopeful. "What if he insists? What if Finch notices the medication levels? We need something more definitive before Tuesday." There was a chilling pause. "Definitive how?" Daniel asked warily. "Just increase the evening dose," Chloe whispered. "Just enough to make her less responsive for a few days. Foggy. Make Finch think Ramirez was mistaken, that it was just a fluke. Increase it more, Chloe, that's risky. Riskier than letting some specialist uncover 9 years of work. Just do it, Daniel. Or I will." The cold calculation in her voice sent ice through my veins. They weren't just going to obstruct. They were actively planning to deepen the sedation to further harm Evelyn to cover their tracks. Detective Miller didn't wait for Tuesday. Armed with the recording of their conspiracy, he knew he had to act. The next evening, as Chloe prepared Evelyn's medication tray in the kitchen, deliberately doing it where the living room camera had a clear view, the doorbell rang. It wasn't a friendly ring. It was sharp official. Before Daniel or I could react, the door opened, and Detective Miller stepped inside, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. Chloe froze, pill bottle in hand. Daniel, coming from the hallway, stopped dead in his tracks, his face draining of color. "Daniel Carter, Chloe Carter," Miller said, his voice calm but commanding. "You're under arrest." "Arrest for what?" Chloe stammered, dropping the pill bottle tablets scattering across the floor. "On suspicion of felony abuse of a dependent adult insurance fraud and conspiracy," Miller stated, producing handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent." The familiar words of the Miranda warning filled the room as the officers moved towards them. The carefully constructed facade crumbled instantly. Chloe began to sob, not tears of remorse but of sheer panic and fury. "This is his fault!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "The old man, he set us up! He's senile, confused!" Daniel just stood there, white as a sheet, seemingly paralyzed by shock. As the officers cuffed Chloe, she fought briefly, spitting insults. "You'll regret this, Ben, you hear me? You'll die alone." Daniel offered no resistance, his eyes wide with disbelief, mumbling, "No, it wasn't supposed to be like this." Watching them being led away, my own children reduced to cornered, desperate criminals, brought no triumph, only a profound, soul-crushing sadness. In the interrogation room later that night, faced with the irrefutable evidence, the video of the medication tampering, the audio recordings of their panicked planning, the bank statements, Sarah Jenkins's testimony, Dr. Ramirez's medical report, their denials evaporated. Chloe tried to blame Daniel, initially painting him as the mastermind who forced her hand. But the recordings clearly showed her active, often leading role. Daniel, confronted with the sheer weight of his betrayal, finally broke down completely. The full confession spilled out, ugly and raw. It was about the money, primarily. The life insurance payout after the accident had been substantial, and Chloe, listed as a contact, had quickly gained control over managing it for Ben's benefit. They'd tasted a lifestyle beyond their means and couldn't give it up. Keeping Evelyn incapacitated meant continued access not only to any remaining insurance funds, but also to my pension and savings, which they systematically drained through fabricated emergencies and outright theft disguised as loans. They saw me as a means to an end, a source of funds, until I eventually passed away, leaving them everything. Their method was insidious, a slow poisoning over 9 long years. They admitted to deliberately administering excessive doses of prescribed sedatives and muscle relaxants, starting shortly after Evelyn came home from the hospital. They'd found a less scrupulous doctor willing to renew prescriptions without thorough follow-ups, easily convincing him it was necessary to manage Evelyn's supposed severe spasticity and agitation symptoms, likely exacerbated, if not entirely caused, by the drugs themselves. They carefully managed the dosages, enough to keep her deeply sedated, unresponsive, unable to move or communicate, but not enough, they hoped, to cause immediate fatal overdose. It was a cruel balancing act performed daily for nearly a decade. Chloe was usually the one physically giving the medication, particularly the evening doses, which were often higher. Daniel handled the financial manipulation, the gaslighting, convincing me I was stressed, or imagining things isolating me from friends, and ensuring the money flowed steadily into their control. They admitted they knew Evelyn wasn't completely gone. They'd seen the flickers of awareness too, the brief moments of connection. Those moments terrified them, spurring them to maintain, even increase, the sedation, ensuring she remained their silent, profitable prisoner. The flashing blue and red lights painted surreal streaks across my living room walls as they led Daniel and Chloe away. Seeing my own children handcuffed, their faces masks of disbelief and dawning terror, wasn't a victory. It was a funeral. The death of the family. I thought I knew the final brutal end of the son I had raised. The house felt unnaturally large and empty after they were gone, filled only with the echo of sirens fading into the night and the wreckage of their final desperate outburst. Detective Miller stayed for a while, outlining the next steps. Formal charges were filed the following day: felony abuse of a dependent adult, conspiracy, insurance fraud, embezzlement. The list was long and ugly. The district attorney's office, armed with the mountain of evidence, medical reports, financial records, Sarah's testimony, and crucially, the damning video and audio recordings, was confident in pursuing the maximum penalties. My role, Miller explained gently, would be crucial. I would have to testify. Months later, the trial began. Walking into that courtroom felt like stepping onto exposed nerves. The air hummed with a morbid curiosity I could feel pressing in on me. Reporters scribbled in notebooks, sketching artists captured grim faces. Daniel and Chloe sat at the defendant's table, looking thinner, paler, their expensive clothes replaced by ill-fitting suits provided by their defense attorneys. They wouldn't meet my eyes. When it was my turn to take the stand, my legs felt like lead. But as I sat there facing the jury, facing the judge, facing the ghosts of my past, a strange calm settled over me. I simply told the truth. I recounted the 9 years of care, the gradual isolation, the constant financial drain disguised as family need. I described finding the evidence, the horror of realization, the agony of choosing between my son and my wife. My voice cracked only once when I spoke of Evelyn's tiny conscious movement caught on camera. Dr. Ramirez followed, presenting his medical findings with clinical precision, explaining how the excessive medication levels systematically suppressed Evelyn's neurological function, masking her true condition, creating a state of artificial paralysis. Sarah Jenkins testified next, her voice trembling slightly, but firm, corroborating the suspicious medication practices and Evelyn's fleeting moments of awareness. The defense lawyers tried to paint me as a grieving, confused old man, easily manipulated, perhaps even senile, echoing Chloe's desperate accusations. They tried to discredit Sarah as a disgruntled former employee. They questioned Dr. Ramirez's conclusions, suggesting alternative medical interpretations. But their arguments crumbled when the prosecutor played the recordings. The courtroom fell utterly silent as Chloe's voice filled the air, discussing increasing the dosage before Dr. Finch arrived. Then Daniel's strained agreement. The raw, undeniable proof of their cold calculation hung heavy in the air, stripping away any pretense of innocence, any shred of doubt. You could feel the shift in the room, the collective intake of breath, the hardening in the jury's eyes. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they filed back in, their faces were solemn, resolute. Guilty. On all counts. The word resonated through the courtroom, not with triumph, but with the heavy thud of finality. Chloe let out a strangled sob. Daniel simply stared straight ahead, his face a blank mask. The sentencing followed swiftly. The judge, his voice stern, spoke of the profound betrayal, the egregious violation of trust, the cruelty of a crime committed not in a moment of passion, but meticulously, day after day, for nearly a decade against a defenseless victim. He spoke of the exploitation of a father's love and a husband's devotion. For Daniel, considering his role in the planning and financial manipulation, the sentence was 15 years. For Chloe, identified as the primary administrator of the harmful medication and a key motivator, the sentence was 18 years. Long sentences. Years stolen from their lives just as they had stolen years from Evelyn, stolen peace from me. There was no relief in hearing those numbers, no satisfaction. Only a vast, aching emptiness where my family used to be, and the grim, undeniable weight of justice finally terribly served. Evelyn at least would be safe now. That was the only solace I could find. After the trial concluded, the first real step towards Evelyn's potential recovery began. We moved her from St. Luke's to a highly recommended neurological rehabilitation center, just outside the city, a place known for its expertise in complex cases. The initial days there were focused on one critical, delicate process, slowly, carefully tapering her off the cocktail of sedatives and muscle relaxants that had held her captive for 9 years. It was a medically supervised withdrawal fraught with potential complications, but absolutely necessary. It was the first key turned in the lock of her long imprisonment. The journey back was arduous, a slow climb out of a deep, dark well. Physical therapy started gently working to counteract years of induced immobility. Therapists patiently moved her limbs, coaxing dormant muscles, celebrating the smallest flicker of response, a toe wiggle, a slight tensing in her forearm. Progress was measured in millimeters in single degrees of motion regained. Speech therapy was equally challenging. 9 years of silence compounded by the neurological fog of the drugs had taken a heavy toll. At first there were only guttural sounds, expressions of frustration. Then, slowly, painstakingly, came mumbled syllables, then slurred words. Her eyes, once vacant, now held flashes of the old intelligence, but also profound sadness, and at times sheer terror, as if recalling fragments of her lost years. There were good days and bad days. Days filled with tiny victories, lifting a spoon halfway to her mouth, forming a coherent 2-word phrase, and days filled with setbacks, exhaustion, and tears of frustration, both hers and mine. The doctors were cautious, reminding me that 9 years of such heavy sedation could leave permanent damage. Full recovery was unlikely. But any recovery, any step back towards the woman she was, felt like a miracle hard won. We celebrated every small milestone, every reclaimed piece of her stolen life. Through it all, I was there. Not as the exhausted, all-consuming caregiver I had been, but as her husband, her partner, navigating this strange new landscape alongside her. The nurses and therapists handled the intensive medical care, now freeing me to simply be with her. We sat together for hours, sometimes in silence, sometimes with me reading aloud, sometimes watching old movies. The shadow of Daniel and Chloe, of their monstrous betrayal, hung between us, an unspoken grief. We didn't talk about them much. The wound was too raw. But in the quiet understanding that passed between us, in the way her hand would sometimes weakly grip mine, in the shared tears that occasionally fell, we began to forge a new connection. It wasn't the easy companionship of our past, but something different, quieter, tempered by shared trauma, yet bound by a love that had somehow endured the unimaginable. We were two survivors learning to live again in the harsh light of a devastating truth. With Daniel and Chloe imprisoned, and Evelyn receiving professional care at the rehabilitation center, a strange silence descended upon my life. The relentless schedule that had defined my existence for 9 years vanished overnight. Suddenly, I had time. Hours stretched before me, empty and vast. The initial feeling wasn't relief, but a profound disorientation, quickly followed by the crushing weight of grief. I hadn't just lost my wife to paralysis. I had now lost my son to his own monstrous actions. There was no funeral for this loss, no casket to mourn over, just the sickening finality of his confession, the image of him being led away in handcuffs. I was free from the burden of caregiving, yes, but adrift in the wreckage of my family, grappling with a betrayal so deep, it felt like a part of my own soul had been amputated. Slowly, tentatively, I began to step back into the world I had left behind. One afternoon, I found myself dialing Dave's number down in Florida. Hearing his familiar booming laugh after so long felt like finding a lifeline. We talked for over an hour, not about the horror of the trial. The news had sadly reached him, but about fishing, about old times, about the simple things. I called Michael too, and we made plans to grab coffee the following week. I even ventured out to my old woodworking shop. The dust lay thick on everything, the tools cold and silent. I picked up a chisel, felt its familiar weight in my hand. I wasn't ready to create anything yet, but just being there, surrounded by the scent of old wood, felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself. The financial pressure had eased significantly, though the scars remained. With the burden of constant home care lifted, and after settling legal fees, I focused my remaining resources on Evelyn's rehabilitation. The center was excellent, but expensive. I made sure she had everything she needed, the best therapists, comfortable surroundings. For myself, I allowed small changes. I replaced my threadbare flannel shirts, bought a new pair of comfortable shoes. I even hired a local kid to help clean up the neglected yard. It wasn't about luxury. It was about moving from mere survival towards a semblance of normal life, using the money not for fabricated crises, but for genuine recovery and rebuilding both hers and mine. The experience had marked me, changed me in ways I was still discovering. I found myself wanting to do something, to make some sense of the senseless horror we had endured. I started attending a local support group for caregivers initially, just to listen, but eventually sharing parts of my story. Hearing others' struggles, their own battles against isolation and burnout, made me feel less alone. Detective Miller connected me with a nonprofit organization that advocated for the rights of elderly and dependent adults. They asked if I'd be willing someday to share my experience anonymously, if I preferred to help raise awareness about the subtle signs of abuse, the insidious nature of financial exploitation within families. The thought was daunting, but perhaps turning our pain into a warning. A source of strength for others could be a way to honor Evelyn, a way to find some meaning in the wreckage. Months melted into a year. Evelyn's progress was slow but steady. She could now sit in a specialized wheelchair, speak in short, halting sentences, and feed herself with assistance. Her memory was patchy, the 9 lost years. A confusing blur, but the spark in her eyes, her awareness was undeniable. One crisp autumn afternoon, I took her to Miller Park near the Boise River. We sat by the water's edge, the golden leaves drifting down around us. I'd brought my old fishing rod more out of habit than any real expectation of catching anything. Evelyn watched the line drift on the current, a small, peaceful smile on her lips. She reached out her hand, trembling slightly, and rested it on mine. "Pretty," she whispered, looking at the shimmering water. "Yes, love," I replied, my voice thick. "It is." We sat there in comfortable silence, the river flowing, the sun warm on our faces. The horror wasn't forgotten. The scars would always remain. But in that quiet moment, surrounded by the simple beauty of the world, I felt a sense of peace I thought I'd lost forever. Justice had been served. Truth had prevailed, and somehow, against all odds, we were finding our way back, not to the life we had lost, but to a new, quieter, hard-won future together. This story is a stark reminder that abuse can wear many masks, sometimes even the mask of family care. Financial exploitation and emotional manipulation often hide in plain sight, preying on trust and love. It teaches us the critical importance of staying vigilant, questioning inconsistencies even when it involves loved ones, and listening to our gut feelings. True care never involves stripping someone of their dignity, autonomy, or resources. Ben's painful journey shows that seeking the truth, however difficult, is essential to protect the vulnerable and ultimately find peace. Courage isn't just enduring hardship, it's also daring to confront betrayal, to reclaim justice and self-worth. What would you have done if you were Ben? So let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and please hit like and subscribe if you found this story impactful.